Hello and welcome to DSA Presents. I'm Deirdre Silverman and my guest today is Elan Shapiro, who's going to be talking about Detroit's solidarity economy. So why don't we begin by talking about what solidarity economy is in Detroit and how you became involved with it or learned about it.
Well, I am involved with a group locally in the Ithaca area called the Coalition for Sustainable Economic Development, as well as with the Building Bridges Coalition for a Just and Sustainable Economy. And we're looking into different ways of doing economic development that really support the people who are most marginalized in the current economy and that truly work for everyone. And my daughter and I were interested in taking a trip together that would be just a father-daughter trip, and I thought that rather than go to a typical tourist destination, it might be really interesting to go to Detroit and hear what was so exciting that we kept hearing about Detroit. And we were very lucky to have an entree because I had a close connection with someone named Malik Yakini, and he's been very involved with the solidarity economy and the urban agriculture movement there for a long time. So we went there this summer for 6 days.
Okay, how old is your daughter?
She is 22 now.
And she's still interested in traveling with you. That's good.
That felt great.
Okay, so what is the solidarity economy?
Well, the solidarity economy, I can't say I'm really an expert on it, but the solidarity economy is an economy that's built around community wealth. People building wealth in their communities rather than having it be owned by absentee corporations. So it looks at the full range of what can happen. Different forms of ownership, different forms of cooperatives, different ways that the city government can act to actually be providing utilities and businesses that have direct public benefit. It's an economy that's designed around all groups, and especially groups that are usually disenfranchised in the dominant capitalist economy, working together to make something work at a scale where people are accountable to each other and collaborating with each other.
Do you know how this got started?
In Detroit?
Detroit, yeah.
Well, it got started in Detroit because of the drastic deindustrialization of the city of Detroit. It's like Detroit is like a poster child for the collapse of the capitalist economy in this country, except it's the forerunner of things that are happening in other places now. And so Detroit got there by having to get there. It didn't get there because it necessarily had a strong ideological framework at the beginning, but it certainly got there by necessity. On the other hand, Detroit has a long civil rights tradition and a very long labor tradition, and it was very strongly influenced by a visionary philosopher, activist, Chinese-American woman named Grace Lee Boggs, who recently died at the age of 100, and who started the Boggs Center there in 1995, and has been active in Detroit for many, many decades, early on with the Black Power movement, but with many other movements that were building the foundation for a solidarity economy.
And so what are the key components of this effort?
Well, some of the major visible components of the effort right now are the burgeoning urban agriculture movement, for example, where Malik Yakini, who I mentioned earlier, is one of the pioneers and coordinators in that movement. He has a place that he's worked on with a number of people called D-Town Farms, but there are dozens and dozens of very significant community enterprises and nonprofit enterprises that are based on farming, that are reclaiming land that has been abandoned. And what's particular about the urban agriculture movement is it's also a movement that is organizing neighborhoods, because people get together over survival around food. And it's generating jobs. It becomes a tool for neighborhood connection and neighborhood unity. So you might look at a piece of land there where it seems like for blocks and blocks there's nothing but a few abandoned houses.
They actually call them in Detroit see-through blocks.
See-through blocks.
Because you can see from one end to the other.
When you look a little more closely, you start discovering that there are these farms, and that they're also, right next to the farms, are also gathering places. So for example, on Wednesday nights, on Wednesday nights, there's something, on Thursday nights, there's something called the Pink Flamingo right next to one of these farms. My daughter and I went to it, and it's a gathering of people who, there's someone there whose little enterprise it's a little trailer called the Pink Flamingo, and they play wonderful music, and they have lights going on all around, and they serve gourmet vegan food at very affordable prices, and they have a big bonfire, and people come from all around to gather there and connect informally, and it's a block away from one of those farms. So that's an example of the really grassroots level stuff that's going on. So there's the urban agriculture piece, but then there's a whole focus on creating neighborhood-based manufacturing enterprises, using new technologies, 3D printing and Fab Lab technologies, using abandoned buildings to as maker spaces. So there's a whole focus on, this is a lot of it is young people beginning to fashion new ways to create neighborhood-based enterprises. Like, for example, we stayed in a building on Field Street, which is in the northeast sector of Detroit, and there's a number of these different collectives that are related to the Boggs movement. And some of the people there were repurposing leather scraps, turning it into boots, and they had a whole enterprise there called Boots on the Ground. Other people liked that idea, but they were more vegan, so they have started a whole enterprise based on hemp boots. So there's all these different things in those places, and if I just described it as an exterior process of new ways of looking at very decentralized, neighborhood-based production and services, that wouldn't quite capture what's so special about the Boggsian movement, and that is that she's written a lot and spoken a lot about a new American Revolution. And her idea about a new American Revolution is that we need to be aware of race, class, place, gender, but we also need to do the work of personal transformation so that we see the world from new eyes, so that we really look at the personal changes we need to make at a soul level, so that we're prepared to be a different kind of person that's not judgmental, that's not creating separations, that's really looking at what is the common bond that we can build on in the solidarity economy. Her PhD was in philosophy, so she's an activist philosopher. She never became an academic, she became a philosopher activist. So her focus on what is that American Revolution, there's a beautiful quote she has which says that we have to redefine revolution so that it's personal transformation to meet the needs of where you live. So it's sort of like the ultimate statement of localized economic development, is that if each person thought about how they can creatively contribute to meeting the needs of where they live, we would be bypassing the failed capitalist system and the failed political system that was going on in Detroit. By the way, you asked me a question which I didn't answer about
what Fab Lab is.
Fab Lab technology. I honestly don't know exactly what Fab Lab technology. It's a term that they use a lot, but it's about people creatively fabricating with what you have. The whole spirit of the movement there is when there's nothing left to lose, you just fabricate with stuff that you have. But what exactly... I was in one place that was called the Fab Lab, and there was many different crafts there, many different things people were doing It was very small scale, but it was an enterprise. People were doing it to help generate the rent in one of those cooperative households. So I have to confess, I don't have a detailed knowledge of Fab Lab.
Okay. So these things sound like, if they were in Ithaca, you would say, oh, this is old Ithaca hippie stuff, or this is young hipster stuff.
Right.
Is it reaching more marginalized populations and minority populations in Detroit, or is this the influx of new young white people, or both?
Excellent question. It is certainly, wherever I went, a multiracial movement, and it has a wide economic range to it. There are definitely young white activists who are involved with this, and then there's another whole sphere of gentrification that's beginning to happen. Mm-hmm. There's certain parts of Detroit that are becoming hip places to go to. Mm-hmm. But the essence of this movement is definitely multiracial, and it's definitely across economic strata. And the people who I met are living in neighborhoods that don't look that gentrified right now, and the concern is to make sure that we reimagine an economy that's really working for everyone. So they're studying what is successful about the community land trusts in Los Angeles and how can that be applied here so the property values don't go from next to zero to suddenly skyrocketing again. Mm-hmm. So it's an excellent question, but what's so inspiring about the movement is it really is multiracial.
Is their goal, do they have a commitment to staying small, or is their goal to move to a larger scale? Do you know?
Definitely the goal is to move to a larger scale, and I just remembered another piece of this is that there's a recognition that you can't just cross racial boundaries without a lot of inner work. So mm-hmm. there's one of the things that is at the root of the urban agriculture movement is a group called the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network that Malik helped to start. And from the very beginning, they noticed that food justice movements all around the country were led by white people. And in order to shift that, they felt that it was really important to have uprooting racism workshops. So they've been doing thousands upon thousands by now of uprooting racism workshops. And in the process, they've made sure that the leadership in the movement is marginalized people, is people of color, but that it's also inclusive. But the white people who are in it, almost all of them have been through these racism, racial justice, or anti-racism workshops. So that's a key piece of it. But you asked me a question after that I want to make sure I'm answering adequately. Well, we'll get back to it.
Yeah.
It was about gentrification.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no quick answer to it. It's a big concern. Mm-hmm. But there are answers all around the country to it, and we have to keep learning from each other.
Yeah, and the land trust is one good solution. Is this focused on the city of Detroit? Does it include, Highland Park and Hamtramck? Is it more of a sort of regional thing, do you know?
The land trust piece?
No, the whole solidarity economy concept.
I would say that it's pretty broad, but the hub of it is, Detroit's a very spread out city.
Yeah.
So it's pretty spread out all over Detroit. It took a long time to get to D-Town Farm, which was on the west end of Detroit, from where we were staying on the east end of Detroit, which is close to where the Boggs Center is. So it's pretty widespread.
Okay, and at the very beginning you mentioned something about city government. And of course Detroit has been plagued by really dysfunctional city government and the state takeover. So how is the city government involved in any productive way?
Well, where I went in our travels, which were admittedly just a few days, there was tremendous skepticism about the role of government. Here in Ithaca, we're just starting a community food council. And Detroit has a great food policy council, that was started through that network that I described. And when I asked Malik, how is the Food Policy Council doing? What advice do you have for us? Because we're just actually birthing that Food Council right now. He said, we started it, it's a great thing, but it's really hard to move anything through the government. So most of the work that we do through the Food Policy Council isn't policy, it's action. It's really, in fact, an action network that helps to coordinate and mobilize the various projects, but it hasn't changed much policy at all. So I would say from my limited vantage point that I'm sure someone could talk in detail about attempts to reform city government there, but that there's a very high level of skepticism about how government is going to be a positive role, and a very high focus on self-determination and neighborhood self-reliance. I mean, what the government has done, where it's invested its energy, is in brightening up the extreme downtown. It's made some very beautiful buildings there, and it's fixed up Greek Town, and it's got a tram that goes around. You could be a tourist going to Detroit and just stay in that part of Detroit and think, oh,
Go
wow.
to the casinos.
Yeah, Detroit is really, upgrading itself. Just like you could go to New Orleans and say, wow, it's recovered so beautifully from Katrina. If you just go to the spots where the big money is putting the nice, glossy stuff for the tourists. But that's not, the Detroit that we're talking about. Detroit we're talking about has a lot of grit, has a lot of determination and a lot of pride and a lot of spirit. And it's got a lot of vision, but it's not got a lot of support from the government.
Mm-hmm. What about the unions? Is there any role for the unions in this?
The unions are extremely important in it, and I don't have detailed knowledge of where those coalitions are right now, so I can't really say, I couldn't say a lot from my visit about that.
And how is all of this funded? Is it all self-generated? Are they getting any external funding support, do you know?
Well, there is funding support from various places. Like I visited a number of places that were supported by the Capuchin monastery that's there. They support, for example, a bakery that hires people who have a history of addiction or incarceration. And those people in that bakery have a whole year where they're supported in their food and their lodging, and they learn basic skills of business, running a business and baking things. And so all around, people said that the Capuchins are doing amazing work in supporting a lot of the urban agriculture stuff, a lot of the cooperative businesses that are around. So that's just one example. I met with someone named Deb Olson, who was from the Center for Community-Based Enterprises, which supports all these alternative models of ownership. And she has a lot of grant money to support a number of different community-based enterprise projects, to do consulting work and bring in teams of people to support all these community-based enterprises. So that's an important piece of the solidarity economy. But how much it's getting from city government, I doubt it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What would you say was the most inspiring thing for you and for your daughter, if it was different? So that's a whole other question. You're looking at it as you, and she's, you said 22?
Yeah.
So were you seeing different things, or responding to it in different ways?
Well, we were, first of all, struck by Malik's model of leadership. He is extremely revered by every person we met wherever we went. And yet he's extremely humble. He's always giving credit to other people. He's always showcasing other leaders. And that was very inspiring to us. The Boggs Center is about developing strong community leadership. So the emphasis on strong leadership, and that's Grace Lee Boggs too. She's all about empowering community leaders. So the model of really shared, empowered community leadership is very strong in Detroit, and we both picked up on that. I don't know if I could say exactly what she picked up on differently than me, But I know that she's very involved in employment issues, unemployment issues in New Haven, where she goes to school. And she really is trying to deeply understand, can this focus on quote-unquote new work and solidarity economy really significantly replace the industrial capitalist model? You know, is it going to generate enough jobs to really deal with the extreme poverty that still exists in Detroit?
And is it going to generate living wage jobs?
Right.
And how do you provide benefits when you have these small enterprises that can't afford health insurance for their workers?
Excellent
and things
question,
like that?
which we're hoping to learn more about, and I can't provide the answers for.
Right. No, it's an ongoing issue. It's an issue in terms of developing micro enterprises and other kinds of employment or self-employment.
Right. I mean, ideally, we would have governments taking our taxes to provide universal health care, universal education through college, all the things that we know make sense and that are being done in other countries. But when that'll happen is not clear. Or whether that's the route that we can even hope for is not clear.
So what lessons do you see for Ithaca?
Well, what happens in Detroit is so extreme that it brings people together across the usual boundaries. It's hard to know how to get that intensity of solidarity to happen in Ithaca, because there are so many ways that the educational enterprises here cushion it. There are so many different ways that cooperative extension cushions it, but we do need to really help each other wake up to the need to create a solidarity economy. If we just rely on city government and county government, we often find that it's still reproducing business as usual, even with the most liberal, progressive people that we know in city and county government. It's not sufficient to make radical change. They're still tied to the model of, we got to get certain businesses to come here. We got to wait a decade or two till we can phase out natural gas. There's still a lot of assumptions that are based on business as usual. So I would say that we need to help each other learn from Detroit that solidarity across race and class and gender is possible. It's an essential thing, and we have to do whatever we can do to pick up on that spirit and make it operational, and not throw out city government, not throw out Cornell and Ithaca College, but not be waiting around for them to do what needs to be done.
Okay, and so how does CSED and building bridges fit in with this?
Well, that's really the mission of both of the organizations, is to activate from the bottom up, to really look at what are the barriers to the leadership of marginalized people, what are the barriers to people becoming an active movement that pushes our liberal legislators to move in the right direction, just as we need to push at the national level, we need to push at the city level, and at every level. We need to build a movement, and that's what CSED and that's what building bridges are about, is using the networking model to build a strong movement so that the vision of a coherent economy that's community-based and community-oriented and that works for everyone is really possible.
I find it's often helpful to think in terms of obstacles rather than barriers, although there certainly are barriers that are structurally imposed. Obstacles are things you can get over. Barriers are more, getting in the way.
I like it.
Just a different way of conceptualizing it. So what do you see as next steps that could happen in Ithaca?
Well, I think that a lot of education needs to happen. There need to be, just as there are study circles about race and racism, there need to be study circles around the solidarity economy. We need to get inspirational speakers here from places like Detroit and Burlington, Vermont, and other places that can show us that this other possibility is real. It's happening in a variety of ways. And we have great people on both of these organizations, people like Jeff Furman, people like Jan Rhodes, people like Kirby Edmonds, who are seeing those examples and who can share about those examples.
Okay, and what are you doing? And you came back with all this stuff from Detroit, and you're involved in these two groups.
Well, I'm using my passionate feeling of possibility to be a very active member in both of the groups. I choose to not be in a model of leadership, but really in the model of really the best work I do, I think, is one-to-one. Mm-hmm. I work a lot with people who need to hear more about this and need to hear that there are different leadership models possible, and that supports their leadership. I feel like a lot of the best work I do is one-to-one work in supporting other people's leadership. Right now, for example, we have a group of white people who support the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a local chapter called Standing Up for Racial Justice. And I'm really happy that the primary leadership in this group are people who are young, many of them are low income, and many of them from different gender identity. And supporting their leadership is really an important thing to do, especially if you're an older white male.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it sounds like you and your daughter had a great trip that brought you back with a lot of ideas. Is there one, we're almost out of time, one summary sentence, one thing that you want to leave people with?
Well, I would say that in light of the climate conference that's going on right now in the world, it couldn't be more urgent to change our economies, because the arguments for continuing business as usual, which is ecocide, are that we can't change the pattern too quickly. But actually, we could change the pattern dramatically and well, and that would have a very direct impact on the emissions that are killing us all.
Okay, thank you. I've been talking to Elan Shapiro about the solidarity economy. Thanks for watching DSA Presents.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.